HOA built a bike path through my pasture. They forgot it was active cattle land. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell me the name of your city or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Thank you for being here. Now, let's meet the man at the center of everything that happened. People think the most dangerous thing on a ranch is an angry bull. They're wrong. The most dangerous thing is someone who mistakes private land for public property. The smell of fresh-cut cedar and damp morning grass usually greeted me before sunrise, but that Thursday, the sharp sting of hot asphalt reached my porch long before the coffee finished brewing. I stepped outside with my mug still warming my hand and immediately heard the low rumble of heavy equipment echoing across my pasture. At first, I figured the county was working on the road half a mile away. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The sound wasn't coming from the highway. It was coming from my own land. I dropped the coffee on the porch railing and climbed into my old pickup, gravel crunching beneath the tires as I headed toward the south pasture. Every fence post along that route had been built by my father and grandfather decades before I was born. I could still remember being 10 years old, holding a post level while my dad laughed because I wasn't tall enough to see over the top of the wire. Those fences weren't decorations. They guided nearly 200 head of black Angus cattle between grazing sections throughout the year, keeping both the livestock and anyone outside the ranch safe. As I rounded the last bend, the entire scene unfolded in front of me like something that couldn't possibly be real. A bulldozer crawled across my pasture, peeling away strips of healthy grass. Two compact rollers followed behind it, packing crushed limestone into a perfectly straight trail. Survey stakes stretched nearly a quarter-mile across the field, each one topped with bright orange ribbon fluttering in the Texas breeze. Workers wearing reflective safety vests moved with the confidence of people who believe they belong there. And right in the middle of my grazing land stood a freshly installed sign that read, Willow Creek Estates Community Greenway, Future Bike Trail. For several seconds I couldn't say a word. I simply stared while diesel engines idled, hydraulic arms hissed, and the sweet scent of clover mixed with the harsh smell of tar. Less than 50 yards away, my cattle had gathered along the remaining fence line, watching the machines with nervous curiosity. A few younger calves paced in circles, unsettled by the unfamiliar noise. Ranchers learn early that cattle don't need chaos to become dangerous. Confusion is enough. One broken fence, one unexpected opening, one frightened animal weighing over 1,200 pounds making the wrong decision at the wrong moment. That's all it takes. I parked beside the nearest excavator and climbed out. A construction foreman looked up from his clipboard before flashing the kind of polite smile people wear when they assume you're simply another curious neighbor. Morning, he called. Pretty nice project, isn't it? I looked from the bulldozer to the sign before answering. You're building a bike trail. Sure are, he replied proudly. HOA wants a scenic route connecting both neighborhoods. It'll be a great community feature. I nodded slowly. You know this isn't community land, right? His smile faded just enough to reveal uncertainty. He checked the papers on his clipboard, then pointed towards several laminated maps covered in colored lines. Everything's been approved. Survey markers are already set. We've got permits. I walked a few more steps until my boots stopped beside one of my own steel property markers, the same marker my grandfather had installed nearly 40 years earlier. It hadn't moved an inch. The orange survey ribbon, however, had been tied directly to it. Someone hadn't just crossed my property line. They had used my property marker as their reference point. Before I could say another word, a white luxury SUV rolled across the temporary gravel entrance and stopped beside the construction crew. The driver stepped out wearing spotless white sneakers that somehow hadn't collected a speck of dust despite standing in the middle of an active job site. Rebecca Holloway, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, smiled like she had just unveiled a new city park. She spread both arms toward the construction work with unmistakable pride. Beautiful, isn't it? She said. Families are going to love riding through here. I looked past her toward the grazing herd, quietly watching every movement from behind the remaining fence. Then I looked back at the unfinished trail stretching deeper into my pasture. Rebecca kept smiling, completely unaware that she wasn't standing inside an abandoned field or in used open space. She was standing in the middle of an active cattle operation that had been running continuously for 3 generations. And judging by the confidence on her face, nobody had bothered to tell her that every foot of concrete she planned to pour would soon become the most expensive mistake her HOA had ever made. My name is Ethan Walker, and I am 42 years old. My family has been raising Black Angus cattle on this land outside Austin, Texas, for longer than I have been alive. My grandfather bought the original 80 acres in 1958 after returning home from military service with little more than a pickup truck, a handful of tools, and a belief that honest work always outlasted shortcuts. Over the decades, my father slowly expanded the ranch one pasture at a time until we owned just over 300 acres of active grazing land. Every fence line, every stock pond, every weathered oak tree carried a memory of someone in my family who had worked before sunrise and long after sunset to keep this place alive. I grew up believing land was something you borrowed from the next generation rather than something you simply owned. My earliest memories are filled with the smell of fresh hay, leather gloves stiff from hard work, and the steady rhythm of cattle moving through wooden gates on cool autumn mornings. While other kids learned traffic lights and sidewalks, I learned wind direction, pasture rotation, and how to read the mood of a 1,000-pound animal by the position of its ears. Ranch life teaches patience because nature never follows anyone's schedule. It also teaches responsibility because every mistake has consequences that cannot be undone with a simple apology. After graduating from Texas A&M University with a degree in agricultural business, I had opportunities to work for large ranching companies across the country. Some friends thought I was crazy for coming back home instead of chasing a bigger paycheck, but every time I drove through the front gate and saw the sunrise stretching across those rolling pastures, I knew I had already chosen the life that mattered most. My father passed away 8 years ago after a long battle with heart disease, leaving the ranch entirely in my care. I still keep his old work gloves hanging beside the barn door. Some mornings I catch myself reaching toward them before remembering they have not moved in years. The ranch is not just my job. It is my family's history written across every acre. We currently run nearly 200 Black Angus cattle under a rotational grazing program that keeps the soil healthy while producing better pasture throughout the year. Every section has a purpose. Some fields rest while others provide fresh grass. Certain gates stay closed during calving season. Water lines, mineral feeders, and fencing all work together like pieces of one carefully balanced system. To someone driving past at 55 miles per hour, it probably looks like an ordinary field with cows. To me, every inch represents planning, investment, and decades of experience. That is why seeing construction crews inside my pasture felt so unreal. They had not wandered onto empty land. They had driven directly into the middle of an operation that supplied local beef processors, employed 6 full-time ranch hands, and supported several neighboring businesses. Yet somehow, nobody had stopped long enough to ask a simple question. Who actually owns this property? Rebecca Holloway certainly never asked. Around town, everyone knew exactly who she was. She had spent years selling upscale homes before becoming president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. If confidence alone determined property ownership, she probably believed she owned half the county. She carried herself with polished certainty, always dressed as though a magazine photographer might appear at any moment. Every neighborhood event somehow became an opportunity for another ribbon cutting, another announcement, another speech about improving community living. People often described her as organized. I thought another word fit much better. Entitled. Willow Creek Estates had expanded rapidly during the previous 5 years as thousands of new residents moved outside the city looking for quiet neighborhoods and scenic views. What many of those homeowners never realized was that those scenic views existed because working ranches like mine had protected the open land for generations. Without active agriculture, those green fields would have become subdivisions long ago. Ironically, the very landscape attracting new families depended on ranchers continuing to do the work many people no longer understood. As I stood there watching survey crews hammer stakes into my grazing pasture, I noticed something that bothered me even more than the construction itself. The workers had already removed nearly 300 feet of interior fencing that controlled livestock movement between grazing sections. They had stacked the cedar posts neatly beside the trail, as though they were clearing harmless debris instead of dismantling critical ranch infrastructure. Most people see a fence as a boundary. Ranchers see it as a safety system. Without those barriers, cattle patterns change, rotations fail, and risks multiply. Rebecca looked at those missing fences and saw progress. I looked at them and saw problems that had only just begun. Rebecca did not waste a single minute celebrating what she believed was another victory for the neighborhood. Before the construction equipment even shut down for lunch, she was already walking groups of homeowners across the unfinished trail, pointing toward my pasture as though she were unveiling the newest attraction at a luxury resort. The afternoon sun reflected off the polished hood of her white sport utility vehicle, while fresh gravel crunched beneath expensive walking shoes that had clearly never stepped through a working cattle field before. I stayed where I was, quietly watching from the other side of the remaining fence. Ranching teaches you that reacting too quickly usually makes problems worse. Whether you are dealing with weather, livestock, or people, patience often reveals far more than anger ever will. Rebecca laughed as several residents complimented the project. One man admired the open countryside, while another talked excitedly about morning bicycle rides with his grandchildren. None of them seemed like bad people. Most honestly believed they were standing inside a future community park because that was exactly what they had been told. They had no reason to suspect they were walking across privately owned agricultural land that had never been offered for public access. Rebecca finally noticed me still standing near my truck. She smiled with complete confidence and waved as though we were old friends. "Ethan," she called, "you should really see the bigger picture here. This is going to improve property values for everyone." I walked toward her, boots sinking slightly into the soft pasture that had supported my cattle for years. "It is difficult to appreciate the bigger picture," I replied calmly, "when someone is building it in the middle of my ranch." Several homeowners exchanged uncomfortable glances, but Rebecca barely hesitated. She pulled a laminated site plan from a leather portfolio and held it in front of me. Colored lines stretched neatly across the page, showing the proposed bicycle trail connecting two subdivisions through what the map labeled as open green space. "Everything has been reviewed," she said. "The developers assured us this corridor was available for recreational use." I studied the map for several seconds before looking back toward the pasture. The drawing was clean, colorful, and completely disconnected from reality. My barns were missing. The rotational fencing was missing. The livestock water system did not exist. Even the stock pond appeared as a decorative blue circle without any reference to agricultural use. Whoever prepared that presentation had designed a park, not documented a ranch. "Did anyone from your board ever speak with me?" I asked. Rebecca folded her arms. "We worked through the proper channels." That was not my question. She hesitated just long enough to answer without actually answering. "The development company handled land coordination before construction began." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. Somewhere between the developer, the engineering consultant, and the Homeowners Association, everyone had assumed someone else had verified ownership. Nobody had bothered to knock on the front door of the ranch that had existed decades before their subdivision was ever imagined. A construction supervisor approached carrying another clipboard. "Ma'am," he said politely, "the crew is ready to remove the last fence section before paving starts tomorrow." Rebecca nodded without looking away from me. "Go ahead." I stepped between the supervisor and the fence line. "Those cedar posts stay exactly where they are." The supervisor looked from me to Rebecca, clearly realizing he had just become the unwilling referee in a dispute he did not understand. "Sir," he said carefully, "our contract requires us to continue unless the county tells us otherwise." I gave him a respectful nod because he was simply doing the job someone else had hired him to do. "I understand. But before another post comes out of this ground, I suggest everyone involved confirms who actually owns the ground beneath your equipment." Rebecca let out a quiet laugh that carried just enough confidence to irritate without sounding openly hostile. "Ethan, you are making this much more dramatic than it needs to be. It is only a bicycle trail." I glanced toward my cattle grazing peacefully less than 100 yards away. A light breeze carried the familiar scent of warm grass and fresh hay across the pasture, while several calves wandered toward the missing section of fence with cautious curiosity. "No," I answered softly. "To you, it is a bicycle trail. To me, it is the center of an active livestock operation. Those are two very different things." Rebecca dismissed my concern with a small wave of her hand before turning back toward the waiting homeowners. already describing future landscaping, shaded benches, and weekend community events as though the project were guaranteed to continue. I climbed back into my pickup without another argument. There was nothing left to accomplish by standing there. My grandfather used to tell me that the loudest person in a property dispute was usually the one carrying the weakest paperwork. As I drove slowly toward the ranch office, the smell of diesel faded behind me, replaced once again by the familiar scent of cedar and pasture grass. I was not thinking about revenge. I was thinking about county records, survey plats, agricultural classifications, insurance files, and every document my family had carefully preserved for generations. If Rebecca believed confidence could replace ownership, she was about to learn that the county courthouse had a much better memory than any homeowners association ever would. The courthouse still smelled exactly the way it had when my father first brought me there as a teenager, a mixture of old paper, polished wood, fresh coffee, and decades of records quietly waiting on shelves. Some people walk into government buildings expecting frustration. I walked in expecting answers. Long before computers stored property history, ranch families learned that every receipt, survey, easement, deed, and tax record deserved a safe place, because someday those papers might speak louder than any argument ever could. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the county records clerk, looked up from behind the counter and smiled the moment she recognized me. My family had been paying taxes in this county longer than either of us had been alive. "Morning, Ethan," she said. "What brings you in today?" I placed a folded aerial photograph of the construction site on the counter beside a recent picture I had taken with my phone. "Someone is building through my south pasture," I said calmly. Her smile faded. "That does not sound right." Within minutes, she disappeared into the archive room while I listened to the quiet hum of the climate control system protecting thousands of property documents. She returned carrying several oversized survey books, subdivision plats, and certified copies of historical boundary records. We spread everything across a large wooden table beneath bright fluorescent lights. One survey after another confirmed exactly what I already knew. The southern grazing pasture had never been subdivided. It had never been transferred, leased, donated, or dedicated for public recreation. Every legal description pointed to the same owner. Walker Family Ranch, continuously recorded for more than 60 years. Then Mrs. Carter found something even more interesting. She slid another document across the table and adjusted her reading glasses. "This subdivision plat might explain what happened," she said quietly. The development company had drawn a proposed greenway corridor running beside my ranch. Beside it was a handwritten planning note stating that any future connection beyond the subdivision boundary would require a separate negotiated easement from adjacent landowners. Proposed, not approved. Negotiated, not granted. I read the sentence twice before a slow smile crossed my face. Someone had treated a future possibility as though it were an existing legal right. That single assumption had apparently traveled from the engineering office to the construction plans and eventually into the Homeowners Association presentation without anyone verifying the final paperwork. "Can I get certified copies of all of this?" I asked. "Absolutely," Mrs. Carter answered. "And Ethan?" "Yes. If equipment is already operating where you say it is, I would not wait very long." I thanked her, gathered every certified copy into a protective folder, and drove straight to the county appraisal district. There I requested the complete agricultural tax history for my ranch. The records showed uninterrupted active agricultural use for decades, including livestock classifications, rotational grazing documentation, and annual inspections confirming commercial cattle operations. Nothing about the property had changed. The law still recognized it exactly as it had for years. By early afternoon, I stopped at my insurance agent's office. Frank Dawson had handled ranch policies for my family since before I graduated from high school. When I spread the construction photographs across his desk, he leaned back in his chair and slowly removed his glasses. "Please tell me they have not opened public access through your livestock fencing," he said. "They already removed part of the interior fence." Frank closed the file in front of him without another word and opened a completely different binder labeled Agricultural Liability. He flipped through several pages before pointing to a highlighted section. "Ethan, this is not only a property issue anymore. If the public starts using that trail inside an active grazing operation, every party involved will have serious liability questions. Your ranch is insured as private agricultural property, not as a recreational park. Hearing an insurance professional say exactly what had been bothering me all morning confirmed my instincts. The missing fence was never just missing wood and wire. It changed how the land functioned. It changed how people entered the property. It changed who could be exposed to unnecessary risk. By the time I returned to the ranch, the paving crew had already extended the limestone base another 200 feet into the pasture. Fresh tire tracks cut across the grass where cattle had grazed only the day before. Rebecca stood near the construction trailer talking enthusiastically with two board members while several residents took photographs of what they believed would soon become their newest neighborhood amenity. I parked quietly beside the barn instead of driving directly toward them. There was no reason to interrupt another conversation built on assumptions. I carried the thick folder of certified records into my office, laid every document across the desk, and began arranging them in chronological order exactly the way my father had taught me years ago. Deed first, survey second, agricultural classification third, recorded plat fourth, proposed easement notation fifth, insurance documentation sixth. Each page fit together like another piece of a puzzle that someone else had never bothered to assemble. Outside my office window, I could still hear distant engines and the occasional beep of construction equipment backing into position. Rebecca believed she was getting closer to finishing her project. What she did not realize was that every additional foot of work created another timestamp, another invoice, another inspection record, and another layer of documentation connecting the Homeowners Association to decisions that the county records had never actually authorized. The next morning started with the familiar sound of cattle moving toward the eastern water trough just after sunrise. Their steady footsteps across the dew-covered pasture usually settled my mind, but that morning another sound interrupted the rhythm. A compact excavator started its engine before 7 o'clock, followed by the sharp metallic clank of construction buckets striking limestone. Rebecca had not slowed the project by a single minute. If anything, the crews were working faster than before. I parked beside the equipment carrying nothing but a leather document folder and a yellow legal pad. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic confrontation. I simply wanted everyone standing on my property to hear the same facts before the situation became even more complicated. The construction foreman greeted me with an uneasy expression. I could tell he had spent the previous evening wondering whether our conversation had been more serious than he first believed. "Morning, Mr. Walker," he said. "We were told everything is still moving forward." I handed him a certified copy of the county survey. "I am not asking you to make legal decisions," I said. "I am asking you to read the legal description of the land you are standing on." He studied the document for nearly a minute before quietly folding it back into my hands. "I will show this to the project manager," he replied. Rebecca appeared moments later, walking across the unfinished trail with the same polished confidence she had displayed from the beginning. She glanced briefly at the papers before smiling. "Still collecting old records?" she asked. "Actually," I answered, "I spent yesterday collecting current records. They all happen to agree with the old ones." She laughed softly as though the entire conversation had become repetitive. "Our engineers have already handled the surveys." "Then ask them one question," I replied. "Where is the recorded easement allowing public access across active agricultural property?" Her smile paused for the first time since I had met her. It lasted only a second before returning. "I am sure the attorneys handled all of that." I nodded. "That is exactly what I hope." Rebecca looked towards several homeowners who had gathered nearby, perhaps realizing this discussion had gained an audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced cheerfully, "sometimes progress makes people uncomfortable. We appreciate everyone's patience while minor paperwork questions are resolved." A few residents smiled politely, apparently reassured by her confidence. Others looked less certain after hearing the words active agricultural property repeated several times. One older gentleman, wearing a baseball cap, stepped closer to me. "Sir," he asked respectfully, "are those cattle usually inside this pasture?" "Every week," I answered. "This field is part of a rotational grazing system. They move through here on a regular schedule." He slowly looked down the partially completed trail stretching toward the remaining fence line. Nobody mentioned that during the neighborhood meeting. Rebecca quickly interrupted before the conversation continued. "The animals stay behind fences. Everything will be perfectly safe." I could have argued with her statement, but there was no need. Frank Dawson's words from the insurance office echoed in my mind. This was no longer just about fences. It was about land use, liability, and assumptions that had never been tested against reality. Around noon, my ranch manager, Daniel Brooks, drove over from the North Pasture after checking several water tanks. Daniel had worked beside my father for nearly 25 years and understood cattle behavior better than anyone I knew. He climbed out of his truck, removed his hat, and quietly watched the activity for several moments. "They cut the rotation lane completely in half," he finally said. "I noticed. We are supposed to move the herd through here next Tuesday." I nodded without taking my eyes off the construction crew. "I know." Daniel studied the trail once more before lowering his voice. "If they open this to the public before then, we cannot safely run our normal rotation." That sentence carried more weight than almost anyone standing there realized. Ranch schedules are not random. Feed programs, pasture recovery, veterinary planning, and livestock movement all depend on predictable routes that have been refined over decades. Interrupt one section, and the entire system begins adjusting around it. By late afternoon, another pickup arrived, this one carrying the engineering consultant hired by the development company. He introduced himself politely, accepted copies of my certified surveys, and spent nearly 15 minutes comparing them against the maps inside his tablet computer. I watched his expression change little by little. First curiosity, then concentration, then something much closer to concern. He excused himself and walked several yards away to make a phone call. When he returned, he did not speak to me immediately. Instead, he walked directly toward Rebecca. Their conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but I noticed something I had not seen until that moment. For the first time since construction began, Rebecca stopped smiling. She turned toward the unfinished trail, then toward my pasture, then back at the engineer holding my survey documents. Whatever he had just discovered was clearly not part of the presentation she had proudly shown the homeowners only 24 hours earlier. And standing there beside the weathered cedar fence my grandfather had built decades before, I realized the strongest evidence in my favor had never been my opinion. It had always been the simple fact that the land itself had never changed, even if someone else's paperwork had. The engineer left the ranch just before sunset, but the expression on his face stayed with me long after the dust from his pickup settled back onto the gravel road. He had arrived expecting to confirm measurements. Instead, he left carrying certified surveys that contradicted the maps his company had been following for months. I stood beside the weathered fence as the evening breeze rolled across the pasture, carrying the familiar scent of fresh grass and warm earth. My cattle had settled into their normal routine again, grazing peacefully as though none of the confusion around them existed. Animals have a way of reminding you that nature never argues. It simply follows reality. Inside my office, every document remained spread across the large oak desk exactly where I had placed it the night before. The original deed rested beside the county survey. The agricultural classification followed next, then the subdivision plat with its handwritten note requiring a negotiated easement that had never been recorded. Beside those sat photographs of the construction site, insurance policy summaries, aerial drone images, and copies of every property tax statement my family had preserved. Looking at the stack, I realized something important. None of this evidence had been created because of the Homeowners Association. My father and grandfather had simply believed that good records protected good land. Their quiet habit of keeping paperwork organized had become the strongest defense our ranch could possibly have. Early the next morning, my attorney, Laura Bennett, arrived carrying a leather briefcase and a yellow legal pad filled with handwritten notes. Laura specialized in agricultural property law and had represented ranchers throughout Central Texas for more than 20 years. She spent nearly an hour reviewing every page without saying much. Occasionally, she circled a paragraph or attached a colored tab to a survey. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "This is one of the cleanest property files I have ever reviewed," she said. "Your family documented everything." "That was my father's habit," I replied. "Then thank him," she answered quietly. "Because whoever approved that construction clearly relied on assumptions instead of recorded documents." She explained that our immediate goal was not to win an argument. Our goal was to preserve evidence while giving every responsible party an opportunity to correct the mistake voluntarily. That meant sending formal notices to the developer, the engineering firm, the construction contractor, the Homeowners Association board, the county planning office, and the insurance carriers connected to the project. Every letter would include certified surveys, legal descriptions, and photographs documenting current conditions. No emotional language, Laura said while organizing the files into separate folders. Only facts. Facts travel much farther in court than opinions ever do. Before noon, we also hired a licensed survey crew to perform an independent boundary verification using modern global positioning system equipment. I walked the property with the surveyors as they carefully located every original iron monument my grandfather had described decades earlier. One by one, the instruments confirmed what the county records already showed. The property corners matched perfectly. The boundary had never moved. The bike trail, however, crossed directly into active agricultural land for several hundred feet. One surveyor quietly shook his head while checking the final coordinates. Someone started construction from conceptual drawings instead of recorded boundaries, he said. It happens more often than people realize. By late afternoon, a small drone hovered above the pasture, capturing high-resolution aerial images requested by Laura. From the screen mounted on the controller, the entire situation became remarkably clear. The unfinished trail sliced through grazing lanes, crossed livestock movement corridors, and interrupted interior fencing that had existed for decades. Looking from above removed every illusion. There was no gray area, no confusing overlap. The project simply did not belong where it had been built. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller identified himself as the project manager for the construction company. His voice sounded noticeably different from our first conversation. Confident people usually speak quickly. Concerned people choose every word carefully. "Mr. Walker," he began, "we have received the survey package from your attorney. We are reviewing everything with our legal department." "I appreciate that," I replied. After a brief pause, he continued, "Until those reviews are complete, we have instructed our crews not to remove any additional fencing." It was not an apology, but it was the first meaningful change since the construction had begun. I thanked him politely and ended the call. As the sun disappeared behind the western tree line, the construction site grew unusually quiet. The steady beeping of equipment stopped. Engines shut down one after another. Even Rebecca's white sport utility vehicle remained parked for only a few minutes before slowly pulling away without the confident tour she had been giving homeowners every afternoon. Standing alone beside the pasture gate, I realized the battle had quietly shifted. Until now, everyone had been arguing over what they believed. From this point forward, every decision would be guided by what the records could actually prove. And in disputes involving land that had been carefully documented for generations, proof has a way of becoming impossible to ignore. 3 days later, the quiet morning I had known my entire life returned to the ranch. But this time it was interrupted by something completely different from construction equipment. Instead of bulldozers, a line of official county vehicles rolled slowly through the front gate. Their tires crunched across the gravel with deliberate purpose, and within minutes the pasture that had been filled with contractors now held county planners, agricultural inspectors, licensed surveyors, insurance representatives, and attorneys carrying clipboards instead of shovels. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody rushed. The only sounds were the gentle hum of cameras documenting the site, the distant calls of meadowlarks drifting across the pasture, and the steady chewing of cattle that seemed completely unconcerned with the gathering of officials. Rebecca arrived shortly afterward in her familiar white sport utility vehicle. She stepped out wearing another perfectly pressed outfit, but the confidence that had followed her through every previous conversation had begun to fade. She immediately walked toward the county planning director with a folder tucked under her arm. I stayed several yards away, allowing the professionals to do exactly what they had come to do. Ranch life had taught me another valuable lesson over the years. Once the right people have the right evidence, the smartest thing you can do is step aside and let the process work. The lead surveyor placed bright orange markers along the original property boundary before inviting everyone to watch the measurements. Using global positioning system equipment and the certified county records, he carefully confirmed every corner monument one final time. Each reading matched the historical surveys within fractions of an inch. When he reached the unfinished bicycle trail, he stopped walking, studied the screen mounted on his equipment, and quietly pointed toward the fresh limestone path. Construction begins inside private agricultural property at this location, he announced. Several officials wrote notes immediately. The agricultural inspector followed next. She examined the grazing lanes, photographed the removed fencing, documented livestock water access, and carefully observed the herd moving naturally through the remaining pasture. After nearly half an hour, she closed her notebook and addressed the planning director. This property is operating exactly as an active commercial cattle ranch, she explained. Interrupting established livestock movement without proper authorization introduces agricultural management concerns that should have been evaluated before construction. Her words were calm, professional, and completely free of emotion, which somehow made them even more powerful. Then came the insurance representatives. Frank Dawson stood beside another specialist reviewing maps and liability documents while occasionally looking toward the unfinished trail. They discussed public access, agricultural classifications, and risk exposure in language that sounded dry to most people but carried enormous significance. Finally, Frank turned toward the planning director. The present layout creates conflicts between recreational use and documented agricultural operations, he said. Those conflicts were not reflected in the insurance materials provided for this project. Rebecca attempted to respond. We relied on the development plans that were submitted during the expansion. One of the county attorneys looked up from the certified survey in his hands. Development plans are not recorded property rights, he replied politely. Those are two very different documents. The sentence hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Several members of the Homeowners Association board quietly looked at one another without speaking. The engineering consultant who had visited my ranch earlier in the week stood nearby with his head lowered, occasionally reviewing notes inside his tablet. I could tell he already understood exactly where the mistake had occurred. The planning director gathered everyone together beside the unfinished section of trail before making the decision official. Effective immediately, he announced. All construction activity beyond the subdivision boundary is suspended pending legal review and property correction. One contractor slowly removed the ignition key from a compact roller, while another shut down an excavator that had been waiting nearby since sunrise. Within minutes, the sounds of machinery disappeared completely. Wind once again became the loudest thing in the pasture. Rebecca stared at the halted project without saying a word. She looked toward the limestone trail, then toward my cattle quietly grazing only a short distance away. For the first time since this entire situation had begun, she seemed to understand that she had never been looking at empty green space. She had been looking at a working ranch that had continued operating exactly as intended, while everyone else built assumptions around it. Before leaving, the planning director walked over and shook my hand. "Mr. Walker," he said, "thank you for preserving your records so carefully. They made today's review remarkably straightforward." I glanced across the pasture toward the weathered cedar fences my grandfather had built so many years earlier. The breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh hay once again, and somewhere behind the barn a gate gently clicked against its latch exactly as it had thousands of times before. Nothing about the ranch had changed. The truth had simply caught up with the paperwork. The following week, the unfinished trail looked completely different. The bright orange survey ribbons that had once marked imagined boundaries were replaced by official county markers identifying the actual property line. Heavy equipment returned, but this time it was not extending the project. It was carefully removing every section of crushed limestone that had been placed inside my pasture. The deep rumble of loaders sounded strangely satisfying because each pass restored something instead of taking it away. Dust drifted through the morning sunlight while crews worked with a level of caution that had been missing from the original construction. Nobody hurried anymore. Every measurement was checked twice. Every load of material was documented before leaving the ranch. I watched quietly from the fence beside Daniel, who folded his arms and shook his head with a faint smile. "Amazing what happens when somebody finally reads the survey," he muttered. I could not help smiling myself. Turns out paper weighs more than concrete. Several members of the Homeowners Association board arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. Unlike the first day, there were no cameras, no speeches, and no guided tours for excited residents. They stood together near the construction trailer, speaking softly with attorneys and insurance representatives, while workers dismantled the project piece by piece. Rebecca remained noticeably quieter than anyone else. She carried another folder beneath her arm, but this time she spent far more time listening than talking. Confidence built on assumptions disappears quickly when every conversation begins with certified records instead of opinions. Later that afternoon, Laura Bennett met me near the barn with several new documents requiring my signature. The developer, the construction company, and the Homeowners Association had reached a preliminary agreement outlining the corrective work. Every portion of the trail built across my ranch would be removed. The disturbed pasture would be professionally restored using approved agricultural soil rehabilitation practices. The damaged fencing would be rebuilt according to the original layout documented in the county survey. Replacement grass suitable for livestock grazing would be planted under the supervision of an agricultural consultant, and my ranch would be compensated for documented operational losses caused by the interruption. Laura placed the papers back inside her briefcase before looking toward the pasture. "This is the outcome we hoped for," she said. "The goal was always restoration, not punishment." I nodded because she was exactly right. Winning never meant watching someone else lose. Winning meant seeing the ranch return to the way it had functioned before a simple assumption disrupted years of careful work. Over the next several days, the transformation continued. Fresh cedar fence posts arrived on long trailers, their clean wood carrying the unmistakable scent that reminded me of weekends spent building fences beside my father. Skilled crews stretched new wire exactly where the original lines had stood, matching old measurements with remarkable precision. Daniel inspected every brace and gate before cattle were allowed anywhere near the restored sections. "These will last another 30 years, he said while tightening one final wire. Hearing those words felt better than any courtroom victory ever could. One afternoon, an unexpected visitor stopped by the ranch. It was the older homeowner who had asked me whether cattle normally grazed inside the pasture. He climbed out of his pickup holding a small paper bag from a local bakery. "I figured I owed you an apology," he said. "Not because I did anything personally, but because I never questioned what we were told." We sat on the tailgate of my truck sharing fresh cinnamon rolls while looking across the restored field. He admitted that many residents had simply assumed the open land belonged to the subdivision because that was how it had been presented during community meetings. After the county review, several homeowners had requested clearer oversight procedures for future projects and stronger verification before approving improvements beyond neighborhood boundaries. "Most of us moved here because we loved seeing ranches like yours," he said. "It would be a shame if we forgot why the view existed in the first place." That conversation stayed with me long after he drove away. It reminded me that mistakes often spread because assumptions spread faster than facts. A few weeks later, the Homeowners Association held another public meeting. This time, the discussion centered on new review policies, independent boundary verification, and better communication with neighboring landowners before approving future developments. Rebecca attended, but another board member presented most of the agenda. I heard later that she had chosen not to seek another term as president. Whether that decision came from personal reflection or community pressure hardly mattered to me. What mattered was that the lesson reached far beyond one unfinished bicycle trail. Every person involved now understood that respecting property begins long before construction equipment arrives. It begins with taking the time to ask one simple question before making plans on someone else's land. Autumn arrived quietly that year. The restored pasture turned deep green again after weeks of careful reseeding, and the fresh cedar fence posts gradually weathered into the same silver-gray color as the older sections that had survived my grandfather's lifetime. If you drove past the ranch a few months later, you would never know construction equipment had once crossed that field. The only tracks left behind belonged to cattle moving peacefully between grazing sections exactly as they had for generations. Every Tuesday morning, Daniel and I opened the eastern gate just after sunrise, and the herd followed the familiar rotation through the restored lane without hesitation. Watching those animals settle back into their routine felt like watching the ranch breathe normally again after holding its breath for far too long. One cool October morning, I walked the repaired fence line, carrying the same worn leather gloves that had belonged to my father. The crisp air smelled of cedar, fresh hay, and damp earth after an overnight rain. Sunlight reflected across the stock pond while a pair of blue herons stood quietly near the shoreline. I stopped beside the original steel property marker that had started everything. It still stood exactly where my grandfather had driven it into the ground decades earlier. Construction crews had come and gone. Lawyers had arrived and left. County officials had filled notebooks with measurements. Yet that simple marker had never moved even an inch. It reminded me that truth does not become stronger because someone finally notices it. Truth simply waits until people are willing to see it. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from the county planning director. Inside was a brief note thanking my family for maintaining such complete historical records and informing me that the county had adopted additional verification procedures for projects bordering agricultural property. Future developments would now require independent boundary confirmation before construction approvals could move forward near working ranches and farms. Reading those words gave me more satisfaction than any financial settlement ever could. If our experience prevented another family from facing the same situation, then something genuinely good had come from the entire ordeal. Not long after that, the older homeowner who had visited me returned with his grandson. The boy could not have been older than 10. He stared across the pasture with wide eyes as the cattle grazed beneath the afternoon sun. "I have never been this close to a real ranch before," he admitted. I smiled and invited them through the front gate, keeping a respectful distance from the herd while explaining how rotational grazing worked, why the fences mattered, and how every pasture served a different purpose throughout the year. The boy listened carefully before asking a question that made me laugh. "So the cows actually have a schedule?" "They certainly do," I answered. "Probably a better schedule than most people." His grandfather smiled quietly, and for a moment the entire disagreement that had brought us together seemed very far away. Sometimes understanding begins with something as simple as taking the time to ask instead of assuming. Around Thanksgiving, I found myself standing alone beside the barn just before sunset. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold while the wind gently stirred the tall grass surrounding the pasture. I reached into my truck and pulled out the old photograph of my grandfather leaning against the very first fence he built on this ranch. Looking from the faded picture to the restored field in front of me, I realized he had given me something far more valuable than land. He had given me the patience to protect it the right way. There were moments during those difficult weeks when anger would have been easier. But anger fades. Good records endure. Honest conversations endure. Respect for the law endures. Those are the things that truly preserve a legacy. Every so often people still ask me whether I ever felt satisfied watching the unfinished trail disappear. My answer always surprises them. I was never happy because someone else's project failed. I was grateful because the right outcome finally replaced the wrong assumption. There is an important difference between revenge and justice. Revenge tries to make another person suffer. Justice simply restores what should never have been taken away in the first place. Today, whenever I hear the steady click of a pasture gate closing behind another successful cattle rotation or the quiet rustle of grass beneath a Texas breeze, I think back to those hectic days and remember how easily confidence can outrun careful preparation. Land does not recognize opinions. It does not reward the loudest voice in the room. It remembers boundaries, records, responsibility, and the people willing to protect them with patience instead of pride. My family's ranch is still here because each generation understood that ownership is not proven by speeches, signs, or promises. It is proven by stewardship, by respect, and by the quiet strength of doing things the right way long before anyone is watching. And every time I pass that weathered steel property marker standing firmly in the pasture where it has always belonged, I smile because it reminds me of one simple truth. Justice is never the loudest thing on the land. It is simply the last thing left standing.